It was a blistering summer afternoon in a quaint southern U.S. town. The sun blazed down on the clean, tree-lined streets of a well-off suburban neighborhood. Houses stood proudly with manicured lawns, picket fences, and neatly trimmed hedges. The tranquility was occasionally interrupted by the hum of lawnmowers or the cheerful chatter of children playing in backyards. 16-year-old Jayden Thompson walked down one of these streets, carrying a brown paper grocery bag in his arms. He had just come from his grandmother's house, where he'd dropped off her weekly groceries and stayed for a short chat. His steps were light. He hummed a tune to himself, savoring the warm breeze and looking forward to getting home for dinner with his mom. Unbeknownst to Jayden, he was being watched. From the bay window of a grand two-story white colonial house, Mrs. Patricia Carter stood with narrowed eyes. A retired schoolteacher in her late 60s, Patricia prided herself on being vigilant about her neighborhood. Spotting a young black teen walking along the sidewalk, her thoughts turned instantly suspicious. Asterisk. What is he doing here? I've never seen him before. This doesn't feel right. Patricia's heart rate quickened as she continued to observe Jayden. He wasn't doing anything out of the ordinary, just walking. But to her, his very presence seemed out of place. The neighborhood was predominantly white, and she couldn't recall ever seeing anyone like Jayden here. Her mind raced, and before she had a chance to second-guess herself, she grabbed her phone. 911, what's your emergency? The dispatcher's calm voice answered. This is Patricia Carter. I'm in Brookfield Estates, and there's a suspicious person walking around. He looks like he doesn't belong here. Can you describe the individual? He's, a young man, black, probably a teenager. He's carrying a bag and he looks, I don't know, out of place. He's been walking up and down the street. The dispatcher asked Patricia a few more questions, but her answers remained vague. She mentioned no criminal activity, only her unease. Nevertheless, officers were dispatched to the location. Patricia hung up, her hand trembling slightly but her resolve intact. Asterisk, better safe than sorry, she thought to herself. Meanwhile, Jayden continued on his way, unaware of the storm brewing around him. The crickets chirped softly, and a neighbor's sprinkler sprayed an arc of water over a lush green lawn. He was just a few blocks from home when he heard the distant but unmistakable sound of sirens. Moments later, a police cruiser pulled up to the curb just ahead of him, its lights flashing. Two uniformed officers stepped out. Jayden froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Confusion swept over him. What was happening? Why were they here? Hey, kid! One of the officers called out as he approached. Can you stop right there? Jayden's instinct told him to comply. He set the grocery bag down carefully on the sidewalk and raised his hands slightly, palms open. Is something wrong, sir? He asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Where are you headed? What are you doing in this area? The officer asked, his tone neutral but firm. I'm on my way home, Jayden replied, gesturing in the direction he was walking. I live just a few blocks over. At that moment, Patricia emerged from her house, her face a mask of concern and self-righteousness. There he is, she exclaimed, pointing at Jayden. That's the boy I called about. He's been wandering around here for a while. Jayden's eyes widened in disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, but the officers were now fully focused on him. One of them asked for his ID, while the other began questioning him about why he was in the area. Patricia crossed her arms, nodding as if her assumptions were being validated. This is a safe neighborhood. We don't usually see people like him around here, she said, loud enough for Jayden to hear. The weight of her words hit Jayden like a punch to the gut. His confusion turned into anger and humiliation, but he swallowed it, knowing the situation could escalate if he reacted poorly. As the officers continued their questioning, a black SUV turned onto the street and slowed to a stop nearby. Inside the SUV was Jayden's mother, Layla Wilson, the mayor of the town. What happened next would change the dynamic entirely. The police officers stood a few feet from Jayden, their presence commanding and stern. One officer had his hand resting on his utility belt, not far from his holstered firearm, while the other held a notepad, scribbling down details. The flashing red and blue lights of their cruiser painted the scene with an air of urgency that seemed entirely unwarranted. Jayden, still holding his hands slightly up, tried to remain composed. His voice was steady, but the tremor of frustration was beginning to surface. Sir, I told you, I'm just walking home. he said again, glancing briefly at the grocery bag on the ground. Where exactly is home? One of the officers asked, his tone skeptical. Can you provide an address? It's just 2 streets over, Jayden replied, providing the address. I live there with my mom. But the officer's suspicion didn't wane. The other officer chimed in. Do you have ID on you? Jayden shook his head. I didn't think I'd need it to buy groceries. Behind the police, Mrs. Patricia Carter stood on her neatly swept driveway, watching intently. Her posture was stiff, her arms crossed tightly across her chest. Her expression bore the smug satisfaction of someone who believed they'd prevented a potential threat. This is exactly what I was worried about, Patricia said loudly enough for everyone to hear. He doesn't even have ID. You see? What's he doing here if he doesn't even live nearby? Jayden turned his head toward her, his frustration bubbling over. I do live here, he said, his voice rising slightly. I've lived here my whole life. Patricia scoffed. I've been here 20 years, and I've never seen you before. You're lying. The officers exchanged glances. They weren't sure what to make of the situation yet, but Patricia's tone, dripping with self-righteousness, seemed to sway them. The older officer leaned toward his partner and muttered something under his breath. Jayden clenched his fists at his sides. His shoulders tensed as the weight of the accusation sank deeper. He looked at the officers, trying to keep his voice calm despite the anger and humiliation coursing through him. This is ridiculous, he said. Can I please just call my mom? She can clear this up. Before the officers could respond, Patricia interjected again. Calling his mom? She said, almost mockingly. That's a convenient excuse. What if she doesn't even live here either? The younger officer turned back to Jayden. We'll let you call her in a minute. First, we need to verify your story. As tension thickened in the air, the faint sound of an approaching vehicle became audible. A sleek black SUV rolled down the street, slowing as it approached the scene. The SUV came to a stop at the curb just a few feet away from where Jayden and the officers stood. The door opened, and out stepped a tall, poised woman in a sharp navy blue suit. Her presence was commanding, her expression calm but determined. Layla Wilson, mayor of the town, had arrived. Excuse me, she said loudly, her voice cutting through the tense atmosphere like a blade. The officers turned toward her, their initial reaction neutral, until they realized who she was. Recognition flickered across their faces, and their posture shifted slightly, now tinged with unease. Jayden's eyes widened in relief. Mom, he breathed, his voice barely above a whisper. Layla strode forward with purposeful steps, her heels clicking against the pavement. Her gaze swept over the scene, taking in her son's tense posture, the officer's guarded expressions, and Patricia's self-satisfied stance. What is going on here? Layla demanded, her tone sharp yet composed. The officers hesitated for a moment before one of them spoke. Ma'am, we received a call about a suspicious individual in the neighborhood. We're just conducting a routine check. Layla raised an eyebrow, her gaze moving to Jayden, then to Patricia. Suspicious individual? She repeated, her voice laced with disbelief. This is my son. He lives in this neighborhood. What exactly is suspicious about him walking home with groceries? Patricia, suddenly pale, took a hesitant step forward. I didn't know he was your son, she stammered, her previous confidence faltering. He just looked out of place. Layla's piercing eyes locked onto Patricia, who squirmed under her gaze. Out of place? Layla echoed coldly. In his own neighborhood? The officers shuffled awkwardly, clearly uncomfortable with how the situation was unfolding. One of them attempted to diffuse the tension. We were just following up on the call, ma'am. We didn't mean any harm. Layla crossed her arms, her gaze unwavering. Harm has already been done. My son has been publicly humiliated and treated as a suspect simply for walking home. Do you understand the weight of your actions? Patricia opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her face flushed as the reality of her bias began to sink in. Jayden stood silently, watching his mother with a mixture of pride and awe. For the first time that day, he felt a flicker of hope that justice would prevail. The tension in the air was almost palpable. Layla Wilson, the mayor of the town, stood tall and composed, but the fire in her eyes made it clear that she would not let this slide. Jayden, still visibly shaken, watched as his mother took control of the situation with a grace and authority that left everyone present in stunned silence. Layla turned to the officers, her voice firm but measured. So, let me get this straight. You stopped my son, a minor, in the middle of the street, questioned him, and demanded identification based solely on a call from this woman. She gestured toward Patricia, who claimed he looked out of place. One of the officers, clearly flustered, shifted on his feet. Ma'am, we didn't mean any disrespect. We were responding to a call about a suspicious individual and… Suspicious? Layla interrupted, her voice rising slightly. What exactly was suspicious about my son? Was it his groceries? The way he was walking? Or was it simply the color of his skin? The officer hesitated, his face reddening. It's not like that, ma'am. We were just… Just what? Layla snapped. Profiling him, harassing him, escalating a situation that never should have been one in the first place? Patricia, who had been silent up until now, suddenly found her voice. I didn't mean any harm, she said, though her voice lacked the conviction it had earlier. I thought he might be, be what? Layla turned to Patricia, her tone icy. A threat? A criminal? Because he's black? Patricia's face turned crimson, and she stammered, No, that's not what I meant. I was just trying to protect the neighborhood. Protect it from what exactly? Layla pressed, stepping closer to Patricia. From a boy carrying groceries? A boy who lives just a few blocks away? A boy who has as much right to walk these streets as you do? Patricia looked down at the ground, her confidence shattered. She muttered something under her breath, but it was clear she had no defense. The crowd that had begun to gather on the sidewalks whispered among themselves, their expressions a mixture of shock and disapproval. Layla took a deep breath, her voice steadying but remaining sharp. This is not just about my son, she said, addressing both the officers and Patricia. This is about a culture of bias and discrimination that allows situations like this to happen again and again. How many times must we endure this? How many more young black boys must be stopped, questioned, and humiliated simply for existing? The crowd murmured in agreement, and the officers exchanged uneasy glances. One of them finally spoke up, his voice quieter now. We're sorry, Mayor Wilson. We didn't realize it was your son. Layla's gaze turned cold as steel. It shouldn't matter that he's my son. He shouldn't have to be related to someone in power to be treated with dignity and respect. You should be ashamed of yourselves. Patricia, now visibly trembling, tried to interject. I just didn't know. If I had known he was your son… Layla raised a hand to silence her. And that's the problem, Mrs. Carter. You didn't bother to know. You saw his skin color and made a judgment. You assumed the worst without a shred of evidence. That is the very definition of prejudice. Jayden, who had been silent through most of this, finally spoke up, his voice quiet but steady. I shouldn't have to explain myself just to walk home, he said, looking directly at Patricia. You don't know me. You don't know anything about me. But you decided I was a threat, and now I'm here, having to defend myself for no reason. Patricia's eyes filled with tears, but Jayden didn't look away. He held her gaze, his expression a mix of sadness and resolve. Layla placed a hand on her son's shoulder, drawing strength from his courage. Jayden is right, she said. This stops now. Not just for him, but for every other kid who's been in his shoes. The officers nodded solemnly, clearly aware they had mishandled the situation. One of them offered a quiet apology to Jayden, which he acknowledged with a small nod, but it was clear the damage had been done. The apology, while appreciated, couldn't erase the humiliation he had experienced. Layla turned back to Patricia. You owe my son an apology, she said bluntly. Patricia's lips trembled as she looked at Jayden. I'm sorry, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jayden didn't respond immediately. He stared at her for a long moment, then simply said, I hope you'll think twice next time. The crowd began to disperse, murmuring amongst themselves about what they had witnessed. But the lesson was far from over. Layla and Jayden returned to their SUV, leaving Patricia and the officers to reflect on their actions and the consequences of their biases. As Layla and Jayden drove away in the black SUV, the atmosphere inside the car was heavy with unspoken emotions. Jayden stared out the window, watching the neighborhood glide past, the familiar streets now tinged with an air of discomfort. His mother, hands firmly on the wheel, glanced at him, her usually composed face etched with a mix of anger and sorrow. "I'm so sorry, Jayden," Layla said softly, breaking the silence. "You shouldn't have had to go through that." Jayden shrugged, trying to mask his feelings. "It's not the first time, Mom. You know that." Her grip on the wheel tightened. "It shouldn't happen at all," she replied firmly, "and I'm going to make sure people understand that." Jayden finally turned to her, his eyes filled with a quiet determination. "You did good back there," he said. "But do you think she really got it? Do you think it'll change anything?" Layla exhaled deeply, her mind racing. "I don't know," she admitted. "But we can't let moments like this pass without speaking up. If we stay silent, nothing will ever change." As they approached their house, the tension began to lift, replaced by a sense of resolve. Layla knew this incident wasn't just about her son. It was about addressing the systemic prejudice that still plagued their community, and countless others like it. Meanwhile, back on the street, Patricia Carter stood on her driveway, staring after the departing SUV. Her arms hung limply at her sides, and her earlier confidence was now replaced by a hollow, gnawing guilt. The words Jayden and Layla had spoken echoed in her mind. "You assumed the worst. I hope you'll think twice next time." Patricia's neighbors had started to disperse, but a few stayed behind, their expressions a mix of judgment and discomfort. One elderly neighbor, a man named Frank, approached her cautiously. "Patricia," he said, his voice low, "you really messed up this time." She looked at him, her face pale. "I didn't mean... I just thought..." Frank held up a hand to stop her. "You thought wrong," he said bluntly. "That boy wasn't doing anything wrong. You judged him before you even knew a thing about him. That's not right." Patricia opened her mouth to respond, but found she had no words. Instead, she nodded weakly and turned back toward her house, closing the door behind her. Inside, she sat down at her kitchen table, her mind replaying the scene over and over. For the first time, she truly began to question her actions and the biases she had carried for so long. The next morning, the incident was already making waves in the community. Several neighbors had posted about it on social media, sharing their outrage at what had happened to Jayden. By midday, the story had reached local news outlets, and reporters began reaching out to Layla Wilson for comment. Layla, seated in her home office, drafted a powerful statement addressing the incident. In it, she called for greater awareness of racial bias and announced plans to implement new community programs aimed at fostering understanding and inclusion. "It's not enough to simply call out prejudice when we see it," she wrote. "We must actively work to dismantle it, starting within our own neighborhoods. This incident is a reminder that bias can show itself in the most seemingly ordinary interactions, and it's our responsibility to challenge it wherever it arises." Jayden read over her shoulder, nodding in agreement. "You think people will listen?" he asked. "They'll have to," Layla said. "Because we're not just talking about what happened yesterday. We're talking about the kind of world we want to build. For you, for me, for everyone." Across town, Patricia sat in her living room, scrolling through the posts and news articles about the incident. Each headline felt like a slap in the face. She saw neighbors she had known for years condemning her actions, expressing their support for Jayden and his family. Her stomach churned with shame. Determined to make amends, Patricia decided to write a letter. She sat down with a pen and paper, her hands trembling as she began to write. Asterisk, Dear Jayden and Mayor Wilson. Asterisk, I want to apologize from the bottom of my heart for my actions yesterday. I let my own biases and fears cloud my judgment, and I caused harm to you both in a way that I deeply regret. I now understand that my assumptions were wrong and unfair, and I'm committed to reflecting on my behavior and learning from this experience. Asterisk, I hope you can find it in your hearts to forgive me, though I know I have much to do to earn that forgiveness. Sincerely, Patricia Carter. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope, vowing to deliver it personally. The story ended not with a single resolution, but with a ripple of change. Layla's leadership spurred new conversations in the community, while Patricia's public apology, accompanied by her participation in community forums on racial bias, served as a reminder that growth was possible, even for those who had made serious mistakes. For Jayden, the incident became a defining moment, It showed him that despite the challenges, speaking up and standing strong could lead to real change. And for Layla, it reaffirmed her commitment to creating a better, more just future. One conversation, one action, and one lesson at a time.